And she specializes in doing research as possible as possible.
My name is Kelly Brown. I'm formerly the director of the D5 Coalition, which was a 5 to 7 year initiative to strengthen philanthropy through a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as some of you may know, or many of you may know, it was an effort that built on really decades of work that had been going on in the field to make these issues and a commitment to these issues part of philanthropy's DNA in terms of its impact and opportunities to strengthen equity. So I'm pleased to welcome you today and to welcome our panelists who will be talking about how do you actually operationalize this work within the culture, specifically of foundations. We know that foundations are unique animals and unique beasts, and some say if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. But there are some actually similarities and lessons that we can learn from philanthropic culture around how to move just beyond advocacy around these issues to actually making it work in terms of the organizations. So we're joined this morning by Nicky Goren, who is the president and CEO of the Eugene and Agnes Meyer Foundation based in Washington, D.C. Next to her is Tamara Copeland, who is currently the president of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers. And at the end is Susan Batten, who's the president and CEO of the Association of Black Foundation Executives, which, as many of you know, is the oldest affinity group in philanthropy and really was at the forefront of kicking off these issues in the field. So before we jump in and hear just some preliminary comments from the panelists, I just want to get a sense of who is in the room. So how many people in the room actually work on the staff of a foundation? And how many people in the room work for a nonprofit organization? And how many are kind of an intermediary, a consultant, a regional association, what have you? Okay, so we have a good mix of folks, and I think that will help us kind of ground our conversations in terms of how we can best support you in your learning around these issues. So I think the panel was assembled because each of these individuals was intricately involved, not only in the work in the field, but also in some specific efforts to help foundations really ground this work in their organizations. And so I just want to ask each one of them just 2 sentences or 1 sentence about what is the perspective that you're going to kind of bring to this conversation. So maybe Susan, we'll start with you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. ABFE is, as Kelly said, an affinity group. We're a membership association, 300 members. Oh gosh, 800 members around the country. I went back several years. But we do a lot of coaching, support, and training with foundation boards and staff on addressing anti-Black racism and applying a racial equity lens to their work. So that's sort of the frame of which I will speak.
So I'm Tamara Copeland from the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, WRAG as we shorthand it. And we are an association of foundations and corporate giving programs. And I guess we are a little different in that a number of the regional associations across the country are focused on the field of philanthropy. And our mission statement is to improve the lives of people who live in our region. And we use the tool of philanthropy to do that. And when we were thinking about how were we working to improve the lives of people in our region, that we recognized that race and racism undergirded a lot of the struggles that people face, and that it was important for us to address it. More than 2 sentences, sorry.
And mine will be even more. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicky Goren. I'm president and CEO of the Meyer Foundation. I'm also vice chair of the WRAG board. And the Meyer Foundation is an independent foundation. We will be 75 years old next year. And I would say for most of our history, we're a fairly traditional philanthropist, a lot of great work to look to and impact in our region, particularly around capacity building, nonprofit infrastructure, leadership development. That's kind of been our legacy. When I came on board 4 years ago and did my listening tour and talked with the community and our partners across the community about what mattered most and where could Meyer have the most impact, it became clear that it was time for us to be much more definitive about what we were trying to solve in our communities. And not surprisingly, there was unanimity on what those were, and inequality at the highest level, with key drivers being employment and education and housing and wealth, lack of wealth. And to think about our work moving from incremental to transformational, and to do that, that meant really starting to look at root causes. And as we talked to our community, as we understood the root causes, the root cause of much of the disparities in our region was racial inequality and systemic racism. And so as we went through our planning, it just became not a choice, it just became a necessity to understand what that meant, what the drivers were, and then how we as an institution could tackle it. And for us, that meant starting internally with ourselves, ourselves, in partnership actually with both people on this panel and many others, and then eventually figuring out how to put it into our programmatic work.
Right. So it sounds like from each of your vantage points, you really did start with what is wrong, or what are the challenges our communities are actually facing, and then what is the responsibility of a foundation or an institution that supports foundations to actually address those issues. But I'm curious around, when you're thinking about issues like racial inequity, which is a systemic, fundamentally, deeply embedded sort of concept in our culture, how did you go about sort of just starting the conversation with philanthropy? And so how do I lay the groundwork for helping foundations actually address these kinds of issues?
Do you want to kick that off?
I can start. I think it was important that there was a precipitating event. And that precipitating event was Freddie Gray here in Baltimore. So when Freddie Gray happened, right in our own backyard, so to speak, there was certainly a sense of, could that happen here in the Washington, D.C. region? And the answer, of course, was yes. And that led to a group of CEOs, including Nicky, coming together to think about what would we do about it. And we started kind of around the table at WRAG's conference room table, and people started suggesting interventions that are those interventions that philanthropy usually uses. So we're going to put more money in workforce. We're going to put more money in housing. We need to put more money in education. And someone recognized that we were doing the same old things. Not that those aren't important, but there wasn't a different intervention that was being discussed. And then we started realizing that people were using language differently. That prejudice and discrimination and equity and equality, and we weren't using that language in the same way. And for us, I think the reality was that we acknowledged the need for education, and we needed to understand some of the structures and how we had gotten to this place of inequity, and how we had gotten to a situation like a Freddie Gray, or like the countless others that have happened across the country, and to use a platform of educating the philanthropic community to move to action.
Can I add, because I was at that table, so I will just add that in addition to what Tamara said, it wasn't just that we were using language differently. Many of us just didn't know the language at all, and I will speak for myself. I mean, I didn't know what words to use. I wasn't comfortable using a lot of the language. You know, some of the foundations had been doing it for 20 years. We were like literally on day one, and then there were people in the middle. And so it wasn't just to educate for the sake of educating, it was to create that shared language so that we could then go deep. And if we hadn't done that, I'm not sure we would have moved forward.
You know, and this is the The good news and the bad news, we have found, to your points about not knowing language and the like, that folks just don't know what they don't know. And so as we move around the country and work with foundations, we are finding, and I think we all understand this because it's not just endemic to our sector, there is a huge fundamental gap of knowledge about the history of this country, and particularly the history around race and racism in this country, right? So it's why it's such an uphill battle. The good news is that we can educate, we can sort of deepen our professional development, opportunities and strategies and the like, but it is a huge uphill battle. And imagine, we're working in a sector where there are folks, particularly in the C-suite, that often maybe are at the pinnacle of their career when they're learning the truth about America and the places in which they invest. And it can be startling, sometimes it leads to not quite sure what to do, throw hands up. But the fact is, I think we are in the middle of a deep awakening in this sector. And that's the good news, is that one, folks don't know, there are also bad people out there, but I would like to believe folks don't know what they don't know. And we're about helping foundations learn about the history, the racial stories of the regions in which they invest. And we can put strategies together to do that. Yeah.
Can I add to, because it just feels like we have started trying to solve a problem when we don't even know what the problem is. And so we're trying to address the presenting problem, the homelessness, the health access, the presenting problem, without really recognizing those structures that undergird it. And because they are so real and have been in place for so long, we just think that it's like the air we breathe. It's just the way it is. And we have to kind of dig deeper to understand how we got to where we are and recognize truly where we are in order to come up with solutions and to address these problems.
Right. And I think that's such an important point, is because there's a method to the madness of why we don't know what's going on, right? There's a strategy in keeping kind of the culture, the larger frame as one of certain sort of cultural hegemony. But I think what's important, and this is maybe to help us transition into how do we make this real for individuals and leaders? As I often say, doing this work is not just about what you know or what you do or what you have, which is kind of how we often want to approach it, very cognitively and cerebrally. But it's about who we are. It's who each of us are in that larger context. And so when you're thinking about, again, from your various vantage points, what does it take to kind of lead this work? To be who you are in this context that you just described, whatever your racial, ethnic, gender background is, you're part of it. And then to actually get information that helps you understand how to lead your organization in a different way. So again, from your different vantage points, and this is all a work in progress, obviously, what have you seen are the kinds of characteristics that leaders have to really lean into this work?
I think it's so contextual, and it really depends on where your starting place is and where your organization is and what it's done before. I mean, in my case, we were starting from scratch. I was the, yet again white leader with a mostly white board in an institution that had been largely white-led and largely funding white-led nonprofits for most of our history, with some exceptions. And so I had to recognize, where we were starting from, both internally and also how it would be received externally. And so, obviously you can say things like it requires humility, it requires a lack of defensiveness, it requires, not taking things personally and knowing that there's so much you don't know and being open to learning that. It requires a lot of personal work, because in order for your institution to walk the talk, or however you want to put it, and then be able to kind of lead efforts in the community, you have to be doing the work yourself. But I can point to other leaders in the country who also took on this work new, but were coming from a a different perspective, had a different upbringing, had already done a lot of racial equity work in their lives, and so they were starting from a different place and maybe therefore approached it in a different way. I don't know that there's one right way. I really think it's contextual to who the leader is and the context in which you're working.
I think for me, I had to evolve from being a leader, a nonprofit leader, to being a Black leader. And that's very different. To elevate who you are racially when society doesn't want you to. So, and I'm just going to be completely candid with this group, I don't think I became a Black leader until Trayvon Martin was killed. And when Trayvon Martin was killed, I have a son who at that time was roughly the same age. And I'm getting chill bumps now thinking about it because it affected me so deeply because I knew that could have been my son. There was nothing besides fate and circumstances that my child wasn't that child. And I wrote about it. WRAG has an electronic newsletter called the Daily RAG, and I wrote about how I experienced that event. And I was in 2012. And I think it was the first time that I had thought about myself as a Black leader. And I talked about how I experienced that as a Black mother of an African American male child. And after I wrote it, I had some CEOs of RAG member organizations, because I talked about talking with my son about shopping while Black, driving while Black, all the things that people will know. But when I wrote it, I never kind of revealed myself in that way to my community, my professional community. And people came up to me, CEOs and staffs of foundations, of RAG member organizations, and they said, I can't believe that you still have to do that. And then I realized how little people knew, how different our experiences were. And I mean people of color would know that, white people may not have known that, because it wasn't their world. And so that's when it became, I thought, part of my responsibility to reveal, to the extent that I could, and in a way over time, what it really means to be Black in America. Because you kind of present as the same person. You present as you have this degrees after your name, and you are in this level of position, and you do whatever you do, and you kind of present as the same person, but your experiences just are so different. And I think that I kind of recognize that.
Wow, I'm so interested in what you're saying. So I forgot the question, but except to say that in terms of my own personal experience, in terms of characteristics of leadership. Prior to ABFE, I was with the Annie E. Casey Foundation and took on the first position that was organized on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I also speak from that perspective as well. And I remember how difficult it was to lead in a space that was a great institution doing amazing work, but was early in its journey on issues of equity and diversity. And I'm looking at Elizabeth right here. In terms of characteristics of leadership, I would say also, I think about it in terms of what I needed, and it was a posse. It was a network, because this work is extremely tough. The support networks are extremely important, particularly for leaders of color, where you can gain your strength, you can cry, and you can keep on going. And so I see our work at ABFE as really protecting who I call the soldiers in the army. I'm no longer inside, but we've got a membership of predominantly Black professionals that are working in institutions around this country. And they're fighting the fights that I was fighting in maybe 10, 11 years ago. And I understand how important it is to provide a level of support for folks that are taking on work that is extremely tough. So while we need patience, we need a collaborative manner of working, we need characteristics around always being open to learning, we also need a posse. And that's for white allies as well, I believe, is to find your support network, because it's tough work and it's long journey work. Yeah.
And I told the story about the RAG blog post because I think you have to recognize your power. That you have a voice and to use the platforms that you have to express that to the degree that you can. But we all have platforms, every one of us. And how do we use those platforms to educate and reveal?
It sounds like there's an interesting kind of juxtaposition between the courage that it takes for people from a dominant culture, as well as people from perhaps a marginalized culture, to actually lean into their courage about being who they are and owning who they are in that work. And it sounds like that is one of the characteristics of being able to lead in this space. I was listening to the news this morning, and Brene Brown was talking about courage equaling vulnerability, and how they seem juxtaposed, but they're actually really two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other, and yet it's different kinds of courage from the vantage point that you're at. But it's interesting what you both say about this idea of having a posse, having a community. And I wonder you can each talk more about how do you actually sort of cultivate that in terms of building your support network for leaning into your courage and leaning into who you are. Because what we've also noticed from the D5 work is that this work is peer work, but it's carefully curated, constructive peer work. So it has to be work where people are supportive, but people also challenge you, right? Because that's how you grow. So maybe if you can all kind of share, like, how did you create them for yourselves, and how are you creating them for others?
Well, Nicky's part of my peer community. I mean, what happened at WRAG was, I think it was 11 CEOs of member organizations came together around this table where I was sharing the conversation. And they agreed that we all needed to learn. And so they backed me. I mean, they were the group that said that we need an educational effort. I mean, we took on the John Gardner quote, the first step in leadership is not action, it's understanding. We internalized that and realized that we didn't understand. And when we presented what I think was a pretty courageous effort called Putting Racism on the Table. I mean, we named it as a effort, an educational series. But it wasn't just something that came, and I'm doing it like this because it was a brochure. But it wasn't just something that came from Tamara Copeland. It came from the 11 people whose names were also on the brochure. And they were 11 leaders within the philanthropic community where people recognized their names. They weren't the tiny foundations, they were the larger foundations in our region or corporate giving programs whose names were recognized, and they were the people who, if their names were on something, then it had gotten the stamp of approval. So I think that having that community, it wasn't that it was simply a RAG as a small infrastructure organization, it was the RAG community. It was the philanthropic leaders who were a part of this work.
And I would add, are you okay if I talk about our other group? So yes. So I mean, then things happen organically, yes. Right? And these conversations are happening. And so, you know, there's a very informal dinner group that includes Tamara and a couple of other philanthropic leaders, and then nonprofit leaders and some consultants, all people who are interested. It's a mixed race group. And we get together once a quarter or so, just to talk about issues related to racial equity and to support each other, but I also feel like just to kind of learn from each other and teach each other. And I think we have some pretty hard conversations. And other groups like that have emerged. So there's now a small group of white leaders in the Washington region who we've just started getting together to talk about, some of the unique challenges of leading this work as a white leader, but more importantly, to kind of call ourselves on our SHIT. So that, I mean, like, really, like, be able to sorry, I shouldn't even have spelled it. It's like with my kids. But really to hold each other accountable and like build that muscle to hold ourselves accountable. And I would say that's very much a work in progress. And then, most recently, I was just talking about a fellowship that I've just started with CEOs from across the country who are working on, whose foundations have taken this on. And to be honest, this is something I've been craving, to have a group of leaders, some of whom have gone through it, some who are kind of on the same pace as us, but aren't necessarily in our community, to learn about what's happening across the country, and also have kind of a little bit of an anonymous place to talk through some of these issues. So I think we kind of look for that group of support in different ways, in addition to the coaches and Hyperteachy and others who are helping us along the way. So.
And I would just acknowledge, I think my most valued peer network are my colleagues, my peers that lead the other racial ethnic affinity groups. Because I also don't want to make it seem like all the tough conversations we have at ABFE are with white allies. Often, people of color are pitted against each other in this sector, in this field. So the conversations that I have with the leaders of Hispanics in philanthropy, Asian American Pacific Islanders in philanthropy, Native Americans in philanthropy can be very tough, because we often are put in places of competing with each other. And it takes time, patience, and love, quite frankly, I'll just say love, to ensure that we're not working at cross purposes and we're actually backing each other. So the Change Philanthropy CEO Circle that we've organized is something that's really important to me here. Yeah.
That's really helpful, and I think it's an important lesson for folks to take away from this as people are engaging in this work, is the need for peer support, however that's constructed. Sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's strategic, but that is actually really crucial. You can't really do this work alone, and particularly at the CEO level and the C-suite level, is because those are very lonely roles, right? And so I want to see if we can turn, though, to then, if you're looking at your context, how do you then bring that into your organizations in terms of the actual function of managing and leading a team through these efforts? I know, Nicky, you've gone through some recent hirings that you said you couldn't have done if you hadn't had some of these preliminary conversations. But there is the important job of managing the day-to-day stuff of a team, and a diverse team, and an inclusive team. So again, maybe you can share from your different vantage points, what have you learned about what works, and what are the challenges, and what should people kind of be looking for in terms of doing it effectively?
Start.
We're all turning to you.
Oh, sure. Well, I think we're talking, I can't say enough the importance of peer networks and peer support. It's interesting, Nicky, that you talked about hiring after you've gone through the learning and professional development, because, at a point in time, we just have to be more intentional about bringing in woke people, right? We are in, as I say, a period of awakening in this sector. There's a lot going on. Many of us have been on this journey for quite some time. And we're spending a lot of time bringing people along. And that's important. We also, though, could make some very intentional decisions about hiring folks, and particularly at the trustee level, getting folks on boards of foundations that bring an anti-racism, racial equity, and social justice frame. So clearly, staying connected to your peers on this issue, bringing in more competency and skill around the issues of race and social justice in particular, I think are sort of ways to think about management. And then, the whole process of institutionalizing this work so that it doesn't leave or go away when a leader that, is woke leaves. We're talking about institutionalizing in policy. I just spent some time with a number of investment management sort of professionals in the field of philanthropy, and we were all looking at the investment policy statements of foundations in one particular region and ensuring that the words were in there around, asset managers of color need to be prioritized and the like. Managing in terms of getting these issues very integrated into policy, but also performance appraisals and the like. Boards should be holding CEOs accountable around their knowledge, competency, and management of diverse teams. Staff should be held accountable about, again, professional development and moving work in communities of color more responsibly. So those are a number of things that come to mind, yeah.
You know, I guess there's no right way to do it, but the way we approach this work is that we did this very intense learning series that was over a year in 2016. And all of our staff, all 4 of them, so we are a staff, full-time staff of 4. There are 12 people who work there at WRAG. 3 of them only focus on AIDS and HIV, and then the others are part-time employees. So the full-time employees of WRAG are only 4. But we had all been through this learning series, so we talked about it. I mean, we had been through this. We looked at structural racism and white privilege and implicit bias, and we looked at all of these issues at a pretty deep level over a year with guidance from a lot of people, including Susan, and on grantmaking with a racial equity lens in particular. So the 4 of us are 3 white people and 1 black person. So looking at it, you would say you need to diversify your staff base, and I would not argue with you. But I'd have to say, but one of those people, I've been there for 12 years. One of those people has been there for 11 years. The other 2 have been there for 8 years. So there's also a stability around association leadership, association management, how we work together as a team. So there is value in that has to, in my view, has to be recognized, as well as simply looking at the racial composition and saying you need a more diverse staff. If you look at our full complement of staff, it is more diverse than the 4 of us, but that is the reality for the 4 of us. So I think that there has to be some recognition of all that contributes to a strong organization. And racial and ethnic diversity and gender diversity is all part of that. But then our board has recently done something that I think is really important. We had 2 organizational priorities. One was affordable housing, and the second was racial equity. And we've had those for about 3 or 4 years, something like that now. And this past June, the board voted that racial equity would be an organizational commitment as opposed to a priority. And in our thinking of what that meant or means, that it is now embedded in our work of our organization. Priorities may come and go based on the needs of the region, that the priorities could change. But we have made an organizational commitment that will last longer than my tenure there or anyone else's, that this organization is committed to racial equity. So I think that there's so many factors that you have to consider when you think about how this topic is embedded into your organization.
So Tamara, can you give some kind of specific examples of how that embeddedness manifests? So whether it's in terms of policies or practices or how people, so when you move on that it remains, what does that actually look like?
So organizationally, WRAG has what we call working groups or affinity groups. The working groups are collectives of funders that are looking at specific issues. The affinity groups are people who have a shared affinity by their job position. Finance officers, CEOs, et cetera, corporate members. So we are looking at we're doing training sessions for all of our members, all of those groups on essentially their body of work with a racial equity lens. So the Healthy Communities Working Group are concerned about health access. We're going to bring in someone to talk with them about how they should be looking at health access with a racial equity lens. So we will provide that kind of training to our membership. We're also very conscious of the speakers who we bring in. Last year, we brought in a woman named Rakaya Adams, and if you have not heard of her, you need to. She is absolutely phenomenal. She is not at this Meyer Foundation, but she is at the Meyer Memorial Trust in Oregon. and I think her title may be Chief Operating Officer, perhaps. But I want to talk for a minute about her because it's also recognizing that our platform, we bring in speakers to our membership all the time. You know, who are those speakers that you bring in? So Rakaya talks about her work is to raise money for her foundation. She is to grow the wealth. That's her job. But she said she suddenly realized that she was growing wealth that was counter to the programming of the foundation. And this is not the example that she used, but if you were investing in for-profit prisons that may indeed improve the asset base of your foundation, but at the same time, you're working for prison reform, there's something wrong there. There's something wrong. So we are very conscious of the speakers who we bring in and the topics that we explore, and we're also conscious of the balance that while we want to embed racial equity in our work, we are not a racial equity organization. We are a support entity to a philanthropic community. And so we make sure that we are balancing the work, but that we bring it in as often as feels appropriate.
Right, and embedded in the actual structures and policies.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So Nicky, what about you again in terms of maybe the sort of the recent period? Can you talk a little bit about how the process of even just identifying these positions, hiring for these positions, has really informed not only the work but also your management and leadership kind of approach?
So, I mean, I could write a treatise on this, and eventually we'll
Give us
actually
a little
put it in
abstract,
writing. So I think, you know, I can check off all of the kinds of things that we've looked at from the perspective of, you know, if you're going to embed it, you need to embed it, and it means looking at everything that you do. So the way we've hired has completely changed. Our process for hiring, where we do our outreach, which has changed, therefore, who is in our talent pool and who we ultimately hire. To the point that you made, we had done sufficient work in this journey on racial equity, both programmatically and internally, that when we did our last round of searches this year, the type of people with the expertise that we needed were coming to apply for the job in a way that I don't think 3 years ago they would have even been interested, because they would have looked at us and said, why would I want to go there? So you know, it's kind of the work then enabled us to bring in that level of expertise that we really need to go to the next level with the work programmatically and from a management point of view. I also created a new position as we did this hiring. We named it, because we make up titles, but it seemed like the good title, Senior Director for Strategy and Equity. So really, and reporting directly to me, really intended to be a kind of internal consultant, because we've been very dependent on external consultants who are only with us so much of the time. They kind of come in, come out, they don't have the day-to-day context. And her role primarily is to continue to drive equity through everything that we do. On the operational side, through our policies. We've done a lot of that work, but there's much more work to go through our programs, and then to be a resource to our grantees for technical assistance around racial equity. She's also looking at all of our communications and the language we use. So having this internal go-to person, both for staff who have questions about equity, and you know, as we kind of move into caucusing by race, and you know, she can help support that, but also for the leadership team and for me to make sure that we are, you know, consistently walking the talk and able to shift our policies and incorporate equity as we go. And this is not, I mean, one of her questions in the interview was like, how long do you think this position will last? And I was, this is a forever thing. So that's been a way that we've institutionalized it, and it's helped me. I would say I don't see your question as an either or. I feel like what we're talking about is the work. It's not like, how do you do this in addition to your work and the management? I feel like this is the work. But having people on staff who really are come with equity embedded into how they work, having this resource on staff, Aisha Young is her name, as a go-to person for me and for the team, it makes me more confident in my ability to manage the work as we go forward and lead the work knowing that I have the expertise on staff. I am not the expert.
Sure. So it's interesting. I want to circle back to one thing that you said about sort of changing the outreach and how even changing your outreach strategies actually made you more attractive to candidates that you wanted to hire. And I'm wondering, because I hear this all the time, so I'm sure we can't find any. They won't come. So I'm really interested in hearing really explicitly about how you actually went about examining your outreach strategies and reaching communities and constituencies and talent and leadership that wouldn't normally surface through your regular process.
Yeah, so we started shifting the way we hired a few years ago a year after I came on board, and I realized that every person we had hired that year, regardless of position, was a white woman. And when I went to the managers who were doing the hiring, and I just inquired, like, what was your process? Who did you reach out to? There were different reasons. I mean, everybody had a different reason, but the result was the same. So at that time, we shifted our practice to, one, use an outside HR consultant to first of all, we looked at our position description and then really scrubbed them. Like, what's really most important for these positions? And we just scrubbed the position descriptions from top to bottom. Then we did outreach we stopped posting things on Idealist and places like that, and actually started in a targeted way posting things through local universities, Howard and Trinity, the community colleges, through our grantees, to affinity groups, Hispanic Caucus. A number of my team members and board are part of large African American women's sororities, so posting it through there. So just changing who we were doing the outreach to. And then we had an external HR consultant do the first review on paper, looking really, really carefully at what can she screen for on paper, objectively. And in that situation, at that time, we were hiring for program officers, and we said, really, like, when it comes down to it, the thing that's most important that she can screen for is community-based nonprofit experience, like at a level enough that they could come in and, like, they understand what it's been like to ask for money, to go to foundations, to run a nonprofit. And so she screened on that basis. I think for that search, we had like 150 resumes. She screened it on that basis, narrowed it down to 70, and then she blinded the resumes. And she sent them to us blinded, and we did the review of these blinded resumes looking for issue area expertise, local community knowledge, racial equity expertise. And then we unblinded them. And in that particular search, we ended up having 14 people go through to interviews, only one of whom was white. And that person was LGBT. So it really took kind of acknowledging we all have implicit bias, that we don't know how it's manifesting in our searches. Let's find ways to eliminate that. And then subsequently, when we did our search this year, Melissa Matzel from Koya Partners, who was our lead and our partner on those searches, we did the same thing with them, which I think was new for you to do it that way. So then, in addition to having their expertise in the broader national outreach, we kind of overlaid these practices, and the results were incredible. And I would say, of the people that we hired in this round, I didn't know any of them. In the people that we were getting in the pools, I didn't know any of them. So it means we were going out of our usual networks.
Expanding
So it was a real shift.
Yeah, that's huge.
I'm actually, this is such a great story, Nikki, and because you all are practicing actually what the research suggests, right, about implicit bias. And if we could figure out how to pull together, the research base around the hiring practices and the like of foundations. I mean, there are studies after study that show name discrimination, right, as it relates to hiring practices. But yet, as a sector, we haven't yet made this real transformative change to address that. And when I was at Casey, we actually stripped the resumes of candidates of educational institutions.
So did we.
Right, and so the research, gives us sort of a sense of how we may go about hiring differently. And we've just got to put those pieces together. And to your point about attracting folks, as we think about issues, particularly on the diversity side of things in the sector, whether it's foundations and nonprofits, right? Folks of color are not going to outreach to an institution that isn't speaking to their issues or their lived experience, right? It was a similar situation where we worked with a number of child advocacy organizations, statewide child advocacy organizations in North Carolina, to frame racial disparity data in the right way and finally get that out into the public domain. And what do you know, lo and behold, they started getting interest from Black professionals to be on their boards, right? The boards that had been predominantly white. But it was getting into the environment and into the air that this organization is speaking to their lived experience.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I want to ask a couple more questions before we open it up to all of you. And I think, to your point, Susan, it's always really interesting in philanthropy how data-driven it feels like it is, except when it's research on kind of how their practice, the data that speaks to their practice. But I do think that there is something about this, kind of this cycle of learning that you talked about, right? So you talk about we don't get done with the work, we just get kind of deeper in the work. This is the work. And I'm wondering if again, each of you can speak to a little bit about your take on this idea of this work sort of being either like a journey, a trajectory, a cycle of like, what is it? Because people often refer to, well, I'm at the beginning and they're at the end. But actually it really isn't like that simple, right? It's a little bit more messy. But I do think it's helpful to be more explicit, is because sometimes I think when people think that they're at the beginning of the journey, that they're one, they're going to get done, or two, that they don't bring anything to the conversation. So if you can kind of talk about what is that movement of work, and how have you seen it sort of deepening and changing over time?
Wow.
Well, I'll start. So we actually called our series a learning series and acknowledged it as a learning journey, and talked about the fact that no one really learns this. No one learns about issues around race and racism. And we had a wonderful speaker, Robin DiAngelo, and she just had a book out called White Fragility, if you haven't looked at it. But Robin kind of probed the audience and said, where did you learn it? You didn't learn it in college. You didn't learn it in law school. You didn't learn it, in master's degree in social work. You didn't learn it there. Maybe you learned a little bit in the MPH program, maybe. But the whole notion of race and racism that people say they know, oh, I get it, and you get it because you perceive yourself as a liberal, and therefore you want everyone to be treated fairly and equitably. But what prevents that from happening, and how we've gotten to that, you don't learn it unless you go on a conscious learning journey. And I think that's what the WRAG community has done, that there is a conscious learning journey that we continue. And to the point that I think there are 3 or 4 people in the room that went with us to the South, that we just literally went on a learning journey, that we took a group to Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, to a lot of civil rights sites with people who were both professionals in museums as well as people who had lived experiences. And when someone talks to you about the experience of her mother trying to register to vote, and this is not a movie as in Selma or a play that you're seeing, but someone says, when my mother went to register to vote, they first asked her to recite the preamble to the Constitution, which she could do because she was a social studies teacher and she had taught that to her students. And so once she successfully recited it, they then asked her to recite the Constitution. Well, constitutional lawyers can't recite the Constitution. Nobody learns the Constitution in that way. Nobody memorizes it. But I think that it is a learning journey, and we try to look for multiple ways to continue that. We took people to a play in Washington called Native Gardens. We took folks to a play called Pool Party. That was, but they all undergird with the message of racial equity. So it's kind of trying to figure out how do you continue the learning in ways that aren't just someone standing in front of a group talking to them.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, for me, it's I chuckled because this is right about when I start to get myself in trouble. Because I think it's important to start with the real truth about organized wealth in this country.
Yes.
And in doing so, and speaking honestly about the fact that we work with and for these institutions that were built on the backs of people of color, and they are not set up to support transformative change. I can't even get that word out. Really good, important work that these foundations do, but when you think about the institutional racism within foundations themselves, we understand why we're struggling with getting the change that we want to see in philanthropic practice. So if we start with questioning just the premise that foundations can really support the liberation of people, then I think we're starting at a different starting line. It's a journey, but the way I think about my journey and how I describe it to others is that, again, it's important to understand the history of this country, the history of philanthropy and wealth creation and the history of this country, and it's just your time. Now is your time. I sit and speak with folks that have been in the field before me to help me understand the fact that they think this work has moved, the conversation has changed. Because I've been in this work now for about 20 years, and I am frustrated with the pace. And it takes Inca or Angela Glover Blackwell to help me understand, Susan, this is different. This is a different conversation than we were having in the late 70s in the field of philanthropy. Now is my time to talk with folks that are coming up after me, to tell them where we are, help them understand what's happened in the past, and now it's their time to actually move the ball forward. So the work doesn't stop. It's generational, and I think we've just got to figure out how to get more intentional about passing batons so that it builds on work that's been done before us. So, yeah.
I agree. I'm not sure I can say it better than that.
Well, I think, again, before we open it up I think that's an interesting sort of segue into kind of this is a room of mixed folks, but we can kind of eyeball a generational kind of shift that if this is your time to make your contribution to this work. Because I'm like you, Susan, I've been in this a long time. And it's different, but right. But every generation brings something new, and so I guess, given again from each of your vantage points, if you were to give a piece of advice for folks who are leaning into their organizations, wherever they are, whether they're at the leadership or whether they're aspiring to leadership, to how do you actually deepen this and embed this in your leadership practice and your organizational culture, what's like one piece of advice you would tell people to do? I'll sum up with some things that I've heard you say, but want to hear it from your mouth.
I think the most important starting place is to understand your context, because context matters, like who you are, where you are personally in your evolution on this, where your organization is, where your board is, and where your community is. They all matter. And that really will determine where you start or where you pick up. So really understanding that for me, is key.
Yeah, I think understanding your audience. For when we started our learning journey, that it was important to have people who were fact-based, because that was who I thought the philanthropic sector would hear, that they were data-driven. And so our first speaker, and it was a man named David Williams. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's on the faculty at Harvard in the School of Public Health. And his presentation was entitled "The House That Racism Built." So on one hand, the title was a bit provocative, but then we balanced that with all the initials that came after his name. And I think that his presentation of facts opened people's eyes to a reality that they didn't know. So I think that it was important for us that we led with facts, that we didn't lead with emotion, I think so.
Yeah, and I would build on Nicky's point for me too in terms of understanding history. So I'll say that as context. And you were talking about Freddie Gray. As we went into Ferguson after Michael Brown was murdered in 2014 and worked with the philanthropic sector there, it was amazing the extent to which we were educating foundation leaders and well-intended community-based organizations about the history of Ferguson and how a suburb of St. Louis that was predominantly white within a 10-year period became predominantly black, over-policed with failing schools, right? And so when you understand that history and context, you understand why Michael Brown was murdered. History is important.
So maybe let's pause and hear from you all. I'm sure this stimulated some thinking and questions. So I see one back there.
Good morning. It's been really great to hear about your experiences. I have some experience in a large nonprofit organization where it was really challenging for EDs of color to really, well, let's just say they had different outcomes in raising money, in the fundraising world. And as someone who's led HR and OD in the organization, we had some really challenging conversations as a leadership team around how the organization had a reward system around those who raised higher dollars and how it just so happened to be the white males or the white females of the organization, and just understanding the system of who are they, going to ask the money, ask for money. And so my question for you all is just, that was in a context of, nonprofit. I'm just curious, in your own roles as leaders who raise money, has that dynamic come up in terms of just, people like to give money to people who look like them, whose kids go to the same types of schools, and there's a little bit of kind of rubbing the shoulders that goes on, and I'm just curious, has that come up in your roles? Has that come up with anyone else in your organization that has some type of externally focused fundraising aspect of your role? And also, how do you deal with that or think about that or talk about that when it comes to the rewards that come along with, who's raised the most money and how that happens within your organization?
Well, we don't currently raise money, but I'm just thinking back to my time at we support, and my time at the Washington Area Women's Foundation, which is where I was before this. We didn't have a reward system. We didn't have anything like that, but I would just say, thinking back, I think you're completely right. When I think about kind of who was on the board at that time and who, the house parties and who was invited to the house parties and where all the money really, the vast majority of the money was coming from the wealthy white female women, because this was a women's foundation, despite the fact that 99% of the people that we were supporting through our grant making were women of color. And it's something that we talked about. I think, since I left, my successor, Jennifer Lockwood-Shabbat, has really actually shifted that organization towards, clearly incorporating racial equity. And I think has really looked at those issues. I think her staff is really diversified, including on the development team. But I think your point is really well taken, and I think it extends to things beyond fundraising, and so when we say that we're looking at our policies and practices internally, and how they, inadvertently but blindly may preference dominant or white staff members, it applies across the board. It applies to your performance management. It can apply to everything that you do. So I think it's important to, if you're going to do this and take a step back and start looking at your policies to systematically, that's the lens that you just talked about is the lens that you need to use.
And you know why? Oh, no, go ahead. It's so, you're speaking my experience. We are a nonprofit organization. We are a Black-led organization. Our mission is about Black people right? And moving philanthropy to our communities of, the data that is scanned, but the data that's out suggests that less than 2% of all foundation dollars in this country go to organizations that are specifically focused on Black communities. So, we're up against a huge issue in terms of fundraising. I think where Nicky was talking about sort of looking at policies, we're trying to get more foundations, nonprofits to use tools like a racial equity impact analysis, right? To look at the reward system and show how, even though we know intuitively that, perhaps white males that have larger networks, you're absolutely right, people give money to people who they know, that some folks will do better than others in terms of raising dollars. So the use of screens and tools become really important. But I also want to say, I think it's important to say, again, because of implicit bias and how it affects all of us. Just one example, we were going for some money. ABFE was actually going for some money to do a pretty major report on the well-being of Black men and boys in this country. This was several years ago. And we were up against a large white mainstream organization that had data capacity. And the Black program officer actually gave the resources to the other group and not us. And it's always the case that we don't have the capacity, we don't have the infrastructure, and I thought I would die because I was telling this one program officer, we don't have the capacity and infrastructure because we don't get the resources. And there are ways in which funders can use their power so that if the grant would have come to us, we would have sub-granted with them anyway because we don't have the tools to do it. And it would have stopped them from calling me every other day trying to help them frame the data that they were collecting, right? So I tell that story because people of color are also impacted and affected by racism and implicit bias and working in these institutions that are racist themselves. And so we've got to keep our folks accountable, people of color accountable as well in terms of fundraising and the like, because I don't know how many of you have heard the frame, the white man's ice is colder. Like, it's gotta be a better product, it's gotta be a better bet. If we give the money to a white-led organization, it's a real issue in this country. So the use of tools, the use of screens, and just keeping folks accountable on where they're putting their dollars, both white colleagues and colleagues of color. Yeah.
The only thing I would add to your question is I wonder if you would have even posed that question 3 or 4 years ago. So I think that our sensitivity to this reality has been elevated, and I believe that certainly is true in my community. In my community in the greater Washington region, that the philanthropic community is more aware of the fact that what you describe happens. Whereas I don't think people would have even thought about it a few years ago. And so the fact that they are more aware of it, I think that there is an increasing number who are getting to the level of awareness of a Meyer Foundation or a Consumer Health Foundation, who are looking at how do they elevate organizations that are led by people of color, organizations that are addressing racial equity, how do they have a different balance in their giving, and there's more and more that are aware of it and are therefore trying to change.
And I would also just add sort of understanding that, I think the shift is actually really important to understanding that what would have been a lack of competency among African American fundraisers is really a systemic bias that biases certain communities, and that you have the power to change that. And I think that shifting the frame from where is the competencies that need to be built. It's not always in the people of color coming in, it's in the institutions in terms of changing their practices and policies and lenses.
Good morning. So deeply appreciative of all of your advice and comments. My name is Claire Minson. I work here locally at Associated Black Charities as a strategist. A part of my work is really working with workforce practitioners and some local foundations on applying a racial equity lens, but really paying attention to the intersection of workforce and the workforce ecosystem and racial equity and how these systems of oppression impact the people that they're serving. My question is really around, because I was working with an organization recently How do you prevent kind of the default to the status quo when in times of crisis or in times of high stress, when you're trying to change the way that, as an organization or your program that you're doing the work, but how do you really either pay attention to when you're defaulting or prevent that default, if that makes sense?
How do you do that, Susan?
I need that advice.
Well, first I got stuck on tell my mentor, Diane Bell McCoy, I said hello. How do you prevent defaulting? Gosh. I really, I think it has a lot to do with who's in the conversation, right? So much of this work, as we all know, is about much more authentically engaging community and communities of color. And where decisions are made, right, where power lies, I think have everything to do with defaulting to the status quo. So this is just a reminder, I think, for me and for all of us that we're talking about fundamentally changing the way philanthropy works if we're talking about racial equity, right? We're talking about fundamentally changing probably, I'd hate to say it, maybe 50 to 60% of the grantee base that has typically been funded by foundations if we're talking about racial equity grant making. So who's in the conversations, who's making decisions, where power lies, are all things that I think we need to consider to make transformative change and divert from the status quo. But because you're right, I mean, things get tight, things get tense, we know what to do, we're gonna put out a grant and this is, and the grant cycle is gonna be a year and this, whatever. And which is really interesting because you mentioned Freddie Gray, Tamara, even with a number of the incidents around the country, well-intended rapid response funds started opening up, right, to address issues of violence in Black communities, Latino communities, and the like. And money moved for the first time to many organizations that never received funding before in a couple of these towns and regions where resources were flowing. We've also seen some pullback, right, or reverting to the status quo, right, after the the furor dies down, right, after an incident. And where things have stuck, I think where I've seen things stick are where foundations have changed literally decision-making practices, governance, engagement strategies, right? So unfortunately, how do we use these incidents to literally change not just, some quick dollars moving out, but how do we change the structures of philanthropy itself? Where the power lies, who's making decisions?
I was just going to say, I think the default will be the default until we have a significant change in our thinking. But how do you stop the default from being the decision? I think is when you actually call it out. Mm-hmm. We're doing the same thing we've always done. Mm-hmm. We're doing it the same way we always have. Did we think about this? When you start peeling back the onion, that I think that we have to, again, it's about using the power that you have, asking the question, or exposing the reality. We're responding the same way we always have. Yeah. And is that, what can we do differently?
Yeah, I agree with that. A concrete example recently, and I know we're being recorded, so I'll say this isn't the cone of silence, understanding that we're being recorded. But
I think we're being live streamed. Are we being live?
So between us, one of the things that we shifted was how our board recruits board members. Because again, it was, who do you know? And it's like all the same people, and then it's like, a very corporate, very white, mostly male board. So we really shifted how they do their outreach, how they do their planning, how they identify the gaps, and we did it that way last year, and it was really successful. And we brought on 4 amazing, very diverse, in experience and age and race, and people that probably would never have been considered for the board 3 years earlier. So fast forward a year, so it's been a year since we went through this, and the committee's meeting again, and it's like amnesia, like we've forgotten. And it is that reverse, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I left the first meeting, I was like, what am I going to do? So what I ended up doing was actually using the arrival of my new senior director, Aisha, saying, I want all my committee members to meet Aisha because she's going to be supporting the board education. And while we were having that conversation, kind of reminded them of the agreements that the committee had made on how it was going to do its work, and their commitment to equity, and making sure that anybody that they're now bringing on the board is at least committed to being on this journey. I mean, just the things that he had agreed to. And I think we've kind of, redirected a little bit, but I think it's really being vigilant, because I think it's actually just human nature, and also the length of time that we were doing it one way versus the length of time that we were doing the new way. We just need to hold ourselves accountable. And at the staff level, we've spent a lot of time and effort creating community agreements that we hold ourselves to, that everyone has a responsibility to uphold, and it includes, calling these things out at any level, so that we can course correct, because I think we just know that it's a little bit inevitable, but we need to be able to course correct.
And I think that's part of the importance around really understanding organizational culture and management, is because change is hard. Any kind of change is hard. People have habits for a reason. It's because it's easy to do what you've always done. And so I think the process of starting, when you start this conversation, acknowledge things are going to get in a crunch. We're going to revert back to what we want to do. We have to recognize that as an opportunity to be intentional and mindful, and know that when we do that and lean into it, we're actually going to get better results. So it'll feel like we're doing good because we're reacting, but we know if we're intentional about this and we expect it, we're going to actually come out better on the other side if we shift our frame. So I see this one, and then over here. Okay.
Hi, Brichette Roussan. I'm with Insight Consulting and also Diversity Fund in DC, and I'm just loving this conversation. And the one thing I want to ask about for anybody on the panel to address is, when we look at intersectionality, one of the biggest factors is generation, right? And so that often maps onto tenure, positional power inside of an organization. And I'm just wondering, any thoughts that you have about sort of getting beyond traditional hierarchical structures in our organizations and the way that they operate, so that we can, have more equity in an organization, and that we're not just looking at race, but we're also looking at how race and generation, for example, operate.
So you wanted me to get all the questions, and then we'll...
Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name's Kevin Hinton. I run an organization in Washington, D.C., which happens to be a Meyer grantee, called Beacon House. And so my question relates to, you talked a lot about the internal and cross-organizational conversations that are happening around the topic of racial equity. I'm curious to hear more about what you're observing in terms of how these conversations are playing out in terms of the actual grant making that entities that you are engaged with are doing today. And I'd be interested in any thoughts you have around how you see these conversations and changes playing out in terms of grant making, say, 10 years from now.
Interesting. Is there anybody?
Hi, my name is Joy Bentley Phillips, and I am with the Academy of Hope. We're an adult public charter school in DC, and I head up our development team, and also am responsible for rolling out race equity at AOH. And so each of you have talked about what you all did in kind of the context of how to think about race equity in the work. Just wondering, is there a roadmap?
Right. Sarah told
Tell me how to do it.
Yes.
And also wondering, we predominantly serve 90% of our learners are Black Americans, and 85% of our employees are people of color. So we're really looking at our board as the first place to start, and just wondering, how is that received when you may have board members who don't even have an understanding about race equity.
Great. So the generational thing and new structures, new hierarchies, is that coming? And how does this play out in the grant making, which is actually a question I think it's important to leave people, is how does this internal work actually shift what you're doing? And then lastly, like, what's the roadmap? Where's the toolkit? How do we do this?
So should I start?
Sure.
Yeah. So on this last question, I don't think there's a roadmap because again, I think it's so contextual. But I do think there are lots of resources out there, and both my colleagues here have a lot of those resources. There are a lot of other organizations. Your former, we looked at all your stuff when we were doing ours. There's a lot of resources out there that we can probably share that give you not necessarily like this is where you start and this is where you end up, because that's just not how it works, but just these are the things to be thinking about as you're doing the work. As far as the board, it's tough. I mean, and Tamara knows this story, that the first time at the staff level when we were in the middle of our strategic plan and we went to our strategic planning committee of the board and we said, this is where we are. We're like shifting to these big community goals. And if we really care about root causes, we have to name systemic racism. And like the board members kind of like sat back in their chairs, like what are you saying? And we realized that we weren't even in a place yet to have the conversation. Now, lucky for me and for Meyer, WRAG had started its series that was for trustees and CEOs, and my board chair and my vice chair and 2 or 3 others of my board members actually did participate. And so they were kind of having this external fact-based education as we were trying to have the conversations at the board, and we're able to come back and actually, having the board chair that I had who had, his awakening through your work, and it was incredibly fortuitous. And so having a couple of board members whose voices were really influential on the board helped bring the rest of the board along in terms of building in an education path. But we've been doing education with the board since we started this, and it will continue. Now, I do think also as they've changed the way they bring on board members, and we're getting a different set of board members who are now joining the board because of what we're doing, as opposed to, this is where we are now. There will be a tipping point at some point on the board where there are more board members who came on because they profoundly believe in the work and understand the work than not. And we're kind of moving in that direction. But I think as a whole, the board has moved because we had leaders on the board who really bought in.
Can I just tell a quick story about your board member? Because he told the story yesterday in a meeting I was in. So this is a white man who is from a family of power in the greater Washington area. And he came to the David Williams session that I mentioned earlier. And this is him reporting. He said, I listened to him and I could not believe what he was saying. I just didn't believe this was true. And I went back, and first I Googled him to make sure his credentials were the credentials.
Well, you have to say he was an African.
David Williams is an African-American man who is a full professor at Harvard in the School of Public Health, and who teaches in the sociology department, and I think it's African studies maybe, or African-American studies. Yeah. But he is well credentialed. And so this person went first and checked his credentials. And he said, and then I checked his facts. He checked, so he talked about the racial wealth gap and how it hadn't changed since, I'm not going to get this right, 1975, maybe something like that, in the 70s. And so this person went and checked his facts. But then he said, and I realized would I have done that if he was white? And I love it when he tells that story, because I think it's a level of self-awareness and growth that is important. And so I would say that he came to the David Williams presentation because Nicky probably invited him, and because this work was going on at the Meyer Foundation where she was trying to move it. But it was a kind of a confluence of events that was important. So I don't think there's any one intervention that causes people to change. It's not any one intervention that causes any of us probably to change our behaviors. But when we're getting this information from a colleague, from an employee, from a neighbor, from, that it's coming to you in so many places that you're more inclined to say, well, there must be something to this because I'm hearing about it now. And if you are willing to be self-aware,
Right.
and this person was particularly willing to do that and talks about it.
And I would add, I'm laughing, I'm looking at Dave. Isn't it David Williams? I've seen so many people try to shut this man down. He is an established researcher, for crying out loud, and it's pretty amazing. We strategize all the time with CEOs and C-suite level folks about board strategy, and so often it's a conversation on staff, particularly with the CEO, about who's movable. Let's just get one or two on the board. We're not going to try to take the whole board there yet, but who's movable, and really think about sort of how do we support, engage one or two key leaders on the board that ultimately can help turn the board. So really thinking about who's movable. Actually, we've had nonprofit board members who are woke go speak to other nonprofit boards about these issues. So it's really a peer-to-peer strategy, right? So how do we get board members talking to board members, perhaps that are from the same experience, look like them, and the like around these issues. Two, I think the points that were mentioned, there's no roadmap. As Nicky said, there are a lot of resources that we have access to, and I know Equity in the Center does. I just want to point out the Advancing the Mission Toolkit from the Annie Casey Foundation. I think what it has done is at least try to document the journey of one foundation. There are probably others out there, but I know that one ad nauseum because I lived it, where we tried to document step by step what that foundation did. Nothing is linear. Those steps work for that foundation and perhaps no other one. And some things go away over time, but there are a lot of resources. That one in particular, I know of that is much more step by step, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So I want to be sure that we don't lose the first questions, the one around generational change and whether we're actually the potential for seeing different kinds of structures that are less hierarchical. And then also, how is this actually playing out in the grant making? Maybe not solve the whole issues of 700 years of racial issues, but how is this actually changing how you're doing your work?
So do you want me to do that? Because I actually am very interested to hear your answer on the first one.
I'm stuck on Bridget's question. I'm stuck on Bridget's question. I know it would come from Bridget because she's thinking a lot about this, because I'm not quite sure in terms of non-hierarchical structures that intersect between race and gender. Yeah. Yeah.
We're struggling with it. We've done things like expand the leadership team so that the organization is flatter, create cross-corporate teams for a lot of what we do. But there's still kind of a need, and maybe this is part of racial equity, I don't know. I don't think that consensus decision-making in an organization necessarily works. I think kind of there needs to be a decision maker, different, doesn't have to be the CEO, but there needs to be decision makers. And then the other thing I found is that even with bringing on, senior or not, different levels of staff with equity embedded, most of us have worked only in dominant cultural organizations and so are used to the hierarchy. And it's hard for everyone to break out of it. And if you have answers, I'm really interested to hear because, I'm looking forward to hearing that.
I also know, Bridget, specifically though, I'm thinking about the Colorado Women's Foundation that brought on some amazing, sharp, I'd say next generation leaders who also happen to be queer and put them right in the leadership of board committees on the board. And it's flipping the whole organization around. It's in not so much of a comfortable way, but in a real way. So I know of strategies where people are going after, next gen, folks and putting them intentionally into leadership on boards. I've seen some of that happen.
But I also think that there are leadership opportunities even within a hierarchy. And that's part of our responsibility to enable people to lead within spheres of influence even when you do have a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right. It's not all about just structure.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's part of the charge for the next generation too, is to help and just it helps set up and establish some of these different kinds of ways of doing work. So let's respond to this question, and then we'll take this last one in the back.
So to your question, what has this shift meant for Meyer? The way it's rolled out is we have restated our mission around equity. We have restated our community goals, which were, as I said, around housing affordability and education and workforce and wealth, around specifically focusing on supporting interventions that are narrowing or eliminating the gap based on race in those issue areas. And what it means from the most concrete thing is really shifting from being predominantly a supporter of direct service organizations that are often, not always, but often addressing the symptoms of the structural issues on the back end, to really trying to tackle things on the front end. So looking at the spectrum of systems change from advocacy and education and capacity building and narrative change. And I mean, there's a number of ways that you tackle shifting the systems. So for example, we're looking at racial equity in education. There are a lot of programs out there working on kind of remediating after the fact, or talking about, well, we want to get these kids excited about school. We're saying no. We want to understand what it is about the school system that's making children not excited about school, and how can we tackle those things. And we're doing that in collaboration with nonprofits who are in community and who are also getting input from parents and students and teachers, and they're actually co-creating what this program is going to be and who we're going to fund. And what they're defining the outcomes, and so that's the kind of shift that we're making. That's the Cliff Notes version. So.
Yeah, and I guess I also, Kevin, would say that at the grantee level, I'm encouraged that we will see more resources flowing to people of color-led organizations. I think that is who's got next, to ensure that the investment conversations continue to flow in that direction. But already from our vantage point, we've got in the state of California, for example, about 5 or 6 foundations that are pooling their dollars to invest in Black-led organizations, right? And we see some conversations happening in the Midwest, in Detroit around that same model, as well as in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So while we've been talking about the need for moving money, we're starting to see actual dollars flow, and I think that's going to be the case for immigrant groups and the like. I think it is to come. I'm hopeful about the 10 years down the road, because again, that's somebody else's job that will take that one forward. I also think that at the grantee level, the broad collaboratives that we're starting to see pop up, you've got an exciting one planned for the Washington region in terms of regional racial equity sort of agendas and strategies rolling out. We're involved in one in November, actually right down the road in Howard County. We've been working with the Horizon Foundation that actually is bringing together over 200 community stakeholders to actually look at a plan for addressing health disparities in Howard County. We're seeing similar things in Buffalo, where the community foundation there is organizing a regional strategy. Understanding and knowing structural racism means, of course, that it is big and large and requires everybody putting their money on the table and changing investment patterns. So my hope is that we'll continue to see the large collaborative efforts. It will be important to watch them to ensure that community is in the front, but we're starting to see some of those roll out. And I think that's going to continue if, in fact, the sector is serious about this work. It's not about what one foundation can do, but how power brings other power to the table to make a change.
And I would just add one more thing. The other thing, Meyer's always been a capacity building funder. And so we've shifted a lot of our capacity building support to help nonprofits embed racial equity, whether they're direct service or not, into the way they work, and to adopt a systems change frame. So that's the other way our grant making is
So
shifted.
it's also like, the idea of capacity building is like, where does this capacity actually have to be built? And sometimes it's within our own organizations and competencies. So one last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, I'm Jenny Billfield. I'm the president of Washington Performing Arts, which has education programs in almost 100 public schools in DC, and then main stage performances all around the city, and 2 gospel choirs that we've had for 26 years. And I've been on, as Nicky knows, I've been on this journey for a couple of years trying to modernize and interpret our founder's motto of everybody in, nobody out. When Patrick Hayes founded the organization in 1966, he turned to Todd Duncan, who was the first interpreter of the role of Porgy in Porgy and Bess, to be the chairman of our board. So in a very segregated city, had an African-American opera singer, an educator as the chair of the board, and that's the foundation of the organization. I think a lot about the status quo and how we actually reinvent the status quo so that when we default to something that reminds us of where we want to go. And over the past few years, and I have friends here, our COO, Lorenzo, and Kay is on our junior board, so they've been on this path, shorter term for Lorenzo and Kay for about 2 years now, trying to build structures that in a sense stack the deck in the direction that we want to go. So 3 years ago, when we started envisioning a junior board of people 40 and under who would model philanthropy of the future, who would have skin in the game, who would give or get $1,000, who would advocate, who would inform us of what sorts of performances and experiences and values they wanted their philanthropic dollars to be used towards, whether it's sponsoring a kids program or a concert, social events, and so on. We had an opportunity to shape a group of 30 people. We hoped we would get 12. We had an abundance of interested people, but to shape a group of people who would really represent a very diverse group, both in terms of background, professional discipline. It ranged from lawyers to teachers to consultants, practicing artists, and many different directions. And it was really exciting to see who showed up, who was vocal, who took a leadership role, and we created a very strong mentoring program between our board and the junior board, so that as the junior board built their muscles around philanthropy and decision making, we imagined how they might matriculate to boards around the city or well beyond. And in fact, 2 or 3 people have either referred people to the full board or become full board members themselves. So this sense of modeling kind of an ideal group of people who were engaged and had impact upon the organization became a real signal for the board that I could turn to, in addition to our women's committee, which was always a very blended group of very dynamic type A women, dating back 45 years, many of whom are still on the women's committee, to be able to say, look, this is part of our founding. It's our women's committee. The junior board is the board of the future. Look at all, to build sort of a critical mass in the direction that we wanted to go. And I think for organizations that do have a chance to build a junior board or a new initiative, to be able to define those values from scratch and to use that as the model of the future to inspire movement. I think our board has taken that as a really good example to study, and when we've been able to use the data to show where people have come from. Often they've been recommended by members of our board. They have the mentoring with our board. It's been a very powerful thing for all of us. And to your point about leading from many different roles within the staff, we have a staff equity task force, and the 7 people from our organization who are here today, which is about 25% of our staff, are people who range from assistants through to senior team members. And all of us are charged with going back to the organization and sharing what we've learned. And that we do so from the position of, you lead from wherever you sit. And it's been a real, an extremely positive and wonderfully self-examining culture change that we feel as though we're across the line But every day it's practice and reminders of the fundamental values and where those values are exhibited. I'm sorry for the long preamble, but this has been kind of building up as you've been talking about different structures and how we shift. Sometimes organizations need to be reminded of the fundamental values on which they're created and use that as a reference point, as the North Star, to say, this is what it meant, this is the impetus. Sometimes organizations drift, but you can find that coming back to center.
And I think it's an excellent kind of point, I think, on which to end, is that you can learn from your peers, and it's important in these sorts of contexts and others, is to get these sharings and these learnings, because people feel like they're doing it on their own. Right. And it's really examples just like that and others that folks have shared that help us realize this is a part of a community of work. And so I just want to, thank Equity in the Center for having this panel, thank all of you for attending and for your questions, and of course thanking the wonderful panel for all of their work. And I am sure that Equity in the Center will facilitate the sharing of a lot of the resources that have generated out of this process and from the folks here, so that you realize you don't have to do it alone. You never get done, you just get better. And this is essential work. I tell people it's no longer optional or ancillary. We gotta get this right. So we're glad you're on this journey with us, and thanks for coming.